I'm delighted that, and I'm sure viewers are, that we have with us the unconventional economist from macrobusiness.com, Leith Van Onselen. Welcome.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Good, and you're what they say is ubiquitous, and that's very good because your advice is so excellent. Leith, it seems as though the economy, at least in the key areas of the private sector, is not growing.
Yeah, it's not too good, David. So on Wednesday, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released the national accounts for the second quarter, and that's what gives you all your GDP results and all those sorts of things. And as it turns out, Australia's economy overall grew by 0.2% in the June quarter and 1% over the year. Now, that's growth, but that was actually the slowest annual rate of growth outside of the pandemic since December 1991. So 34 years ago, roughly, 33 years ago, during the early 90s recession that we had to have. And when you actually break it down, it was actually a lot worse than that, David, because the population grew by about 2.4%. And what that meant is that Australia's GDP fell by 0.4% over the quarter, and it's actually fallen for the last 6 quarters straight, or 7 out of the last 8 quarters. And it's now 2% lower than it was when the Albanese government came into office in June 2022. So what that effectively means is that although the overall economy has grown, everyone's slice of the economic pie has shrunk by 2% over the last 2 years, which is obviously not a good result. And actually, if you break down the internals of the growth, it's even worse, David, because the area that you and I and all the viewers who are watching this care about the most is the household sector. So the economy is basically broken up into 3 sectors. It's broken up in the household sector, which is the largest. Then there's the business sector, and then there's the government sector. And the area that we all care about is the household sector, and the results there were absolutely deplorable. So household consumption per capita, so that's our spending, is now contracted for 6 straight quarters, and it's down 2.4% over that period. So we're all spending less, obviously. But the worst one is that our incomes, so this is real per capita household income, so income once you adjust for inflation and population growth, is actually down by around 8% over 2 years, and that's one of the biggest declines in the world. So although the economy is growing slightly, it's growing through population growth, the household sector is getting smashed, and the only area of the economy that is growing at the moment, David, is actually the government sector. So that's through government spending. So we've basically got 2 economies at the moment. The public sector grew by 1.5% in the June quarter, whereas the private sector actually fell by 0.6%. So we've got a growing public sector and a shrinking private sector. And public sector spending accounted for is now at a record level as a share of GDP. It's never been higher. And the public sector accounted for 0.4% of Australia's growth of 0.2%, which means the private sector went backwards by about 0.2%. So it's a pretty nasty set of numbers there. We're experiencing the longest per capita recession in modern history, dating back to records from the early 1970s. It's not the deepest, but it's the longest. And we're also dealing with the largest decline in real per capita household disposable income in records dating back to pretty much the 1960s. And it's one of the biggest in the world. So it's a very nasty economic situation at the moment.
And as the Treasurer says, is the Reserve Bank's interest rate policy smashing the economy? Is that a fair comment?
It is and it isn't. So it is a fair statement in that, yes, it's smashing the private sector, obviously, and it's the household sector because the households are going backwards. But that's also what interest rates are designed to do. They're designed to hit the private sector economy. That's exactly what they're doing. The problem we've got is we've got what a fellow economist, Tarek Brooker, describes as a burnout economy in Australia. So that's basically whereby the government spending and the government through its policies like massive immigration has got the foot on the growth accelerator, whereas the Reserve Bank's got the foot on the brake. And as a result, we've got higher interest rates and higher inflation than we should. And that's obviously smashing the household sector, especially those with mortgages. Like, one of the reasons that there's three reasons why Australia's household disposable income has collapsed. The first is rising mortgage rates, obviously, and Australia's been hit harder than most other countries because we have a floating rate mortgages or variable rate mortgages. Most other countries are fixed rate. The second one is we've had a big rise in taxes. So income tax paid as a share of our income has gone up quite considerably, even with the stage 3 tax cuts. And that's because of bracket creep and the expiry of the lower middle income tax threshold offset. So that's driven up interest payments. Also, Australia's wage growth, despite all these claims by the Treasurer that we've got strong wage growth, Australia's nominal wage growth before inflation and population growth has actually lagged the rest of the world. So, and at the same time as our inflation's been elevated. So we've effectively, that's why we've had falling household disposable incomes. And that obviously hits mortgage holders the most because they're the ones who get hit by the rising interest rates. And that's about 1/3 of households in Australia who are getting hit by that. So yes, he is right. But at the same time, he doesn't explain his, or the government's contribution to the higher inflation and higher interest rates through their spending. And it's interesting, David, I think one of the reasons why Jim Chalmers has been so aggressive, saying that the RBA is, quote, smashing the economy, is because most opinion polls now have Labor and the Coalition even on about 50-50, which means that if an election was held, we'd probably have a hung parliament. And the Albanese government's been running the line that cost of living, that they're trying to alleviate cost of living. They've identified cost of living as the key issue and the key concern of voters, which it is. But polling released this week by Redbridge Polling Group showed that only 24% of those surveyed could name a single thing that the Albanese government has done to help their cost of living. So roughly 3/4 of those surveyed believe the government isn't helping. And I think we've seen over the pond in New Zealand that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has unexpectedly cut interest rates. So it cut interest rates by 0.25% last month, and it's forecast a whole bunch of additional rate cuts. And what that's done is it's actually led to a bounce in the polls of the incumbent national government, as well as a bounce in consumer sentiment and also government confidence. So I think Labor is praying that the Reserve Bank cuts interest rates before the next federal election, which is due in the first half of next year, because it knows if the Reserve Bank doesn't cut rates, it could be a one-term government.
And is it true that the almost out-of-control immigration is camouflaging what is in effect a per capita recession, and it's hiding it as a recession, being a general recession?
Oh, absolutely. And it's plain in the data. I mean, in the June quarter, the economy overall grew by 0.2%, but we had 0.6% population growth, which meant that we all went backwards by 0.4%. So the only reason why the economy is growing is principally through population growth, through immigration. We've got population growth that's still tracking close to the highest level since the early 1950s at about 2.4%. It peaked at about 2.5%. And when you have that, it's actually very hard to have a recession, because if you import 2.5% of people, or you grow the population by 2.5%, your economy is going to grow by roughly 2.5%. Even if it grows by slightly less than that because you've got lower productivity, you're still getting growth, and it makes it hard to have a technical recession. But we do have a per capita recession. And, of course, the other area why the economy's grown is because we've got this record public spending by the federal government, which has also obviously stimulated growth. But the private sector economy and the household sector, which is where you and I and everyone who's watching this program lives, is incredibly sick. And that's the thing that should concern everyone the most.
You say in another piece that Australia is hostile to the nuclear family, which I take it to mean husband, wife and 2 children. And if we're hostile to that, does this come from the present government, or has it been in place with both governments? Is there some unanimity among politicians in reducing or being hostile in public policy to the nuclear family?
Yeah, look, I'd say this has been pretty much going on since the turn of the century. So there's some pretty good research from HSBC Bank, and it said that basically for every 10% increase in Australian house prices, you get a 1.3% decline in the birth rate. And what we've seen is obviously since the early 2000s, we've seen Australian house prices shoot through the roof. They've rocketed, and to nobody's surprise. And at the same time, we've seen, and part of the reason for that is we've also had this very high migration since the mid 2000s. So Australia's population has grown by 8.3 million people this century, which is an extraordinary number of people, and that's put more pressure on housing. Obviously, it's driven up house prices, and also HSBC also noted that rents is even a rising rents is even worse for the birth rate. So this high population growth we've had really for 20 years has made the problem worse because it's added to obviously house price inflation, and it's also added to rental inflation. And it's kind of culminated last calendar year whereby the number of births in Australia actually fell to just 104,000, which is pretty much a record low. And Australia's birth rate fell to just over 1%, which is incredibly low figure. And basically the government is trying to compensate for this lower birth rate by running a higher immigration policy, but that higher immigration policy is pushing up house prices and rents, which is therefore pushing down the birth rate. So it's effectively, a self-defeating policy in that respect.
The IPA...
And another reason why... Sorry, go on.
And the IPA has confirmed what we all know, and that is that on this vast continent, most of the immigrants come to the three eastern capitals, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, and that forces up the house prices in those places.
Yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, Sydney's population at the turn of the century was just under 4 million. Melbourne's was 3.5 million. Now Melbourne's at about 5.3 million. Sydney's at about 5.4 million. We've had extraordinary growth. Obviously, Brisbane's grown incredibly quickly as well. And those things are all putting upward pressure on house prices. But it's not just the prices, David. It's also the type of houses that are being built now. Most of the housing that's been supplied now, or the new housing that's been supplied or is forecast to be supplied, is apartments, and they tend to be small. 1 and 2 bedroom apartments dominate, and those aren't conducive to raising a family. They're not just expensive, but they're also too small. And let's be honest, you can't swing a cat in a lot of these places. And we mentioned last week that Australia is now looking at micro apartments. Well, if we get a proliferation of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, micro apartments, tiny houses, that's going to be hostile to the traditional family, because it's going to be very hard to raise a family of 4, for example, in one of these tiny apartments. And just to put some numbers around that, I mean, projections from the Urban Task Force for Sydney show that Sydney's dwelling composition is going to change from 55% in 2016 to 25% detached house. So 55% detached house in 2016 to 25% detached housing by 2057. And the quantity of apartments is going to rise from 30% of Sydney's total housing stock in 2016 to 50% by 2057. So effectively, Sydney's entire housing stock is going to shift from detached housing, dominance of detached housing with backyards, to apartments and then also townhouses. And that necessarily means it's going to be harder to raise a family, because they're not going to be conducive to raising a family, because there'll be a lot of this 1 and 2 bedroom stuff. And the houses that are left are going to become incredibly expensive, which is going to make it harder to have a family.
To what extent do you think
Australia is hostile?
Yes. To what extent do you think that this is exacerbated by the fact that we've stayed with the boundaries that we had at Federation? They deliberately, for example, in relation to a new state of New England, when that referendum was put, they deliberately arranged to include what was never considered to be part of New England, that is Newcastle, a strong Labor part of the country at that time, and still probably now. And they, of course, voted no against in relation to having a separate state in New England. And the same things happening similar things happening in Queensland, where even before Federation there was a strong move to divide Queensland into 2 or 3 states. If you have everything concentrated in a state capital, does that exacerbate the housing problem and make people move to those capitals?
Absolutely. So Australia's become more and more centralised. We have a higher proportion of people living in the major capitals than ever. And I'd argue that the immigration program is actually making that worse, because migrants overwhelmingly come to the major capitals. It's actually the locally born population, the share of the population that's locally born that lives in regional areas is far higher than foreign born, whereas the ratios swing around the other way when it comes to the major capitals. So the longer we keep running this extreme immigration policy, we're going to have, people from China, India, etc., who are going to live in the major capitals with their diaspora, which means that we're going to have this increased concentration. And that's actually borne out in the data. I mean, I'll use my home state of Victoria, or Melbourne, my home capital city. And at the turn of the century, we had 3.5 million people in Melbourne. It took us 170 years to get there. And yet the official projections from the Victorian government are to go to 9 million people by 2056. So that's an increase of 5.5 million people in just 56 years. And to get that, the state government wants to shoehorn an extra 2 million people 2 million homes into existing urban footprints, which basically means we're going to have, massive densification, which means apartment blocks, high-rise towers, etc., which is completely non-compatible with the traditional family, because families living in high-rise apartments, especially small ones, which is predominantly what gets built, is a contradiction in terms.
Yes, and is this exacerbated by the growing practice of the federal government to reject proposals for development in rural areas on completely frivolous grounds? For example, in relation to uranium mining in the Northern Territory, and now gold mining near Blaney, these are stopped by the federal government, which once had no interest in relation to such matters as mining. This was a matter for the states. These are being rejected for absolutely frivolous reasons, as we've seen in relation to the gold mine in Blaney in Western New South Wales. And that means that people there have to move down to Sydney.
That's right. And all it does is it basically, deindustrialises the nation. So, we're seeing it with manufacturing, etc., which a lot of that used to be in regional areas, is disappearing, as well as mining, etc. And all it means is that we're going to become an increasingly service-based economy, a low productivity economy, I'll add, with a lot of basically people servicing industries and big government in, capital city areas, living in apartments, and then inexpensive apartments that are expensive to both purchase and rent, and poor quality, and therefore we'll have lower birth rates. And then the solution will be just to import more people from overseas, which will then make all those problems even worse. It's a ridiculous situation.
And it gives so much more employment to Uber drivers, usually new immigrants to Australia. And it would be wonderful if they could spread across Australia, if there were jobs to have across Australia. But if you close down the gold mines and other places because you've decided that for some frivolous alleged Aboriginal reason that these should not go ahead, then you're really forcing people to, if they come to Australia, just stay with their diaspora, as you call it, rightly call it, in the capital cities.
Yeah, and let's be honest. When the post-war migration boom happened, it was done with a plan. Australia's population was 8 million people in 1950. We just had the Second World War. We were underpopulated, but it was done with a plan to basically build out industries and new industries, etc., all over Australia. Regional in the cities, etc. Nowadays, all those industries are shrinking or have already left in the case of manufacturing in a lot of cases, and yet we're running the same populate or perish policy. But now it's just basically been concentrated into people servicing industries in the capital cities, which tend to be low productivity, and they're not export industries or anything. And it's just a recipe for basically low productivity growth, lower living standards, and just I think it's a step backwards. High-rise shoebox living.
And as you've pointed out, with the nickel industry, and possibly with iron ore in the future, there's no guarantee that we're going to have those rivers of gold that we had at the beginning of the century.
Yeah, unfortunately not. That's and that also brings into focus the federal government's massive expenditure on areas like the NDIS, aged care, etc., and everything else. It's all predicated on the fact that we're going to have this never-ending resources boom and windfall. And as I've said repeatedly, although that's been great for raising corporate taxes, we don't raise nearly as much as we should have, and we haven't put it away for a rainy day like Norway's done, and Qatar and all these other places that actually set up, sovereign wealth funds, etc., to store their mineral wealth, which they can then draw upon in the future when that mineral wealth, inevitably shrinks. And we haven't done that, unfortunately.
This has coincided, has it not, with the emergence of the career politician, the person who goes to the university, and while they're at the university and soon after work with politicians, they become advisors at a very early age, and one of their primary ambitions during that advisorship is to find a safe seat and find a power broker who will get them into that safe seat. And then they become a politician and they have absolutely no experience of the real world. I think Tanya Plibersek is a classical example of this, as is the Prime Minister.
It's not just politicians; it's also senior bureaucrats. I mean, we've seen, we've seen it across the board where these senior bureaucrats and are basically getting paid exorbitant salaries of close to $1 million. And you got to ask yourself, for what? So I think it's politicians, but it's also the senior public service, the bloat in the public service as well.
Well, once again, Leith, you've really, from your in your position as unconventional economist, you've really given us the true background in relation to so many matters affecting this country. Thank you so much, and thank you for the contribution you make in this regard.
Thanks, David. I'll speak to you next time.
Certainly.